Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to your podcast, New Books in Economic and Business History. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today we have a very special episode. I'm very happy because we have today with us Josh Ober. Josh is professor of political science and classics at Stanford, where he also has a courtesy appointment in philosophy. Josh is also the founder and head of the Stanford Civics Initiative. We're going to be talking about that in a bit. And Josh is one of my mentors, and that's probably what makes this episode like particularly special. He's someone I admire profoundly, and I learn a lot from him each time I have even the briefest of the conversation. So I'm sure that all of you are going to learn a lot during this conversation as well. We have Josh today because, he's an expert on ancient Greece. He's going to tell us more about his career in a bit. But he published recently this book called The Greeks and the Rational: The Discovery of Practical Reason. It's edited by the University of California Press, and it's a fascinating book. We're going to talk also about that book in a bit. But I think that probably every economist is going to be interested in this book, and he's going to tell us a bit about that today. So, Josh, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Javier. It's delightful to be able to have this conversation. And I'll just say right off the bat, I've learned an awful lot from you as well. I mean, just because I have gray hair doesn't mean I stop learning.
Thank you, Josh. It's actually interesting that we're having this conversation remotely today. Our offices are next to each other at Stanford, so we interact like on a daily basis. But now we're recording this remotely, and maybe I would like to start by asking you about your career. So you're one of the biggest experts in ancient Greece, but how did that happen? So you're someone that grew up in Minnesota. When did you ended up being interested in ancient Greece? How did you manage to learn ancient Greek? Like, tell us about how you built your career, please.
Yeah, thank you. It was, in some ways, quite accidental. I wasn't a very good student when I was in high school. I went to the local university, University of Minnesota, almost accidentally. I'd sort of considered not even bothering with higher education. It was the early 1970s. At that time, I had a lot of other things I was interested in that didn't have much to do with higher education. So I did started taking classes, and one of the very first classes I took was in Greek history. More or less, that was an accident. It was a course that was available. It fit my schedule. I had, as a kid, always enjoyed Greek mythology, and I sort of remembered that. And so I thought, well, why not try it? And I totally fell in love with it. The professor was very old school, very, in many ways, kind of rigid and demanding, but he cared so passionately about his field. And he convinced me that, yeah, I should care passionately about it too. So at the end of this course, introductory course, 12 weeks later, I went to his office and said, well, I've decided I want to be you. I want to be a historian of ancient Greece. And he kind of looked me up and down and said, no, it's not going to work. You could see why he thought that. I mean, I didn't sort of come off as the kind of person who was likely to go on and have a career as a Greek historian. But I then said, well, just in case I was going to try to do this, what would I have to do? And he says, well, you have to learn Greek. And so I began learning Greek and then Latin and, of course, then continuing to study history. And one thing led to another. That eventually I found myself with a Ph.D. In Greek history. And that was that.
How did you manage to make people in political science interested in what you're doing? So you have this very interesting profile in which um, people from many different disciplines pay attention to what you do, right? And I guess that your natural ecosystem was the people in classics departments and history departments. At what point do political scientists and even economists now realize that you had something interesting to say, or like were you looking for that explicitly? Was that like an unexpected outcome? What was that process like?
It was, in some ways, once again, somewhat accidental. My first job after I got my Ph.D. was at Montana State University, which was in some ways, not a big liberal arts center. It had no other person studying the ancient world, no classics department. So I was pretty much on my own. And I could read what I wanted and talk to whoever I wanted. I was lucky enough to get a postdoctoral appointment at a research center that had some very distinguished sociologists and economists attached to it. They suggested that I read some things that I probably wouldn't have read otherwise. And I suddenly found myself doing a kind of Greek history that was quite different from the ordinary work that was being done by most other Greek historians. I probably couldn't have gotten away with this if I was actually at a conventional classics department or in a history department that had other ancient historians. But because I was off in Montana doing whatever I pleased, really, I was able to develop a project that was really quite different from a lot of the work that was being done. And when the book was published, this was a book called Mass and Elite in Democratic Athens, I found that a lot of people beyond the world of Greek history thought it was interesting because that was using some social science methods that were still pretty unusual for ancient historians at that time.
So now I'm curious about your perspective on this type of research now, considering that now you're in a more conventional place, and now, well, probably Stanford is not conventional at any level, but part of, I guess, the core of the academic world, how much space do you see for people trying to do this type of interdisciplinary research? Do you think that are we getting more close to those ideas? Are there more spaces and we're just complaining a lot about that? What's your take? And also, like, so you advise like many students, like how do you talk about this with your students?
Yeah, I do. And when I first began to direct graduate students, I moved from Montana State to Princeton University on the strength of this book that people got interested in. And I told my students at that point, when I started directing graduate students, that it was really a risk for them, that the kind of work I was doing was not mainstream. I was now in a classics department, and the students there had very good language background, but I said the kind of work that you're going to do if you study with me is probably not the kind of work that every other Greek historian is going to be doing, or every other person studying Greek literature is going to be doing. And so I tried to be as honest as I could, and happily, it worked pretty well. That they ended up doing really new kind of scholarship projects that were at least were legible to me, but were beyond anything I was going to do. They had certain skills, they had certain ideas. So it turned out that the field was willing to accept this body of new work. So this really began in the 1990s and has continued on since. So I think there is space for it. The difficulty is that it's really necessary, if you're going to do this kind of interdisciplinary work, to really know, as it were, both sides of the equation. You've got to really know your history well. For a classical scholar, you've got to know classical literature. You've got to know the right languages, as well as really knowing the social science work well enough anyway to be able to use it without being embarrassing, to use it in a way that a social scientist, a political scientist, an economist can read it and say, yes, this makes sense. You're not making silly mistakes. You're not importing concepts that are simply foreign to the social science milieu. So it's very demanding, but I think it does create space for genuinely new work. So instead of just doing the same thing, maybe a little better, maybe a little worse than the previous generation of scholars do, we can actually do work that wasn't imagined by the previous generations of scholars, and began to really expand out both our understanding of the past, but also we can test theories, we can test hypotheses that are generated from social science by a whole new body of evidence, by a world that is not modernity, but is well enough documented to allow us to do some real testing.
Let me use that last element that you bring to the conversation to start talking about your book, or just like first starting to bring the ancient world to our conversation. And I've always had this question in my head, which is why everything at some point seems to date back to ancient Greece, right? And I guess, and I've always wanted to ask you this actually, which is, what was the special thing that this period, this society had, that somehow we are able to learn so many things still nowadays? And I guess that, like, a simple answer is that you can always learn from other people and other societies, and maybe there's nothing particularly special about ancient Greece. Or maybe is it a marketing story in which they just took like a great set of things of other peoples and they just synthesized that pretty well? Or maybe they were like truly innovative, or I don't know, maybe I guess I'm speculating too much. What would be your answer to that type of question? What was special about ancient Greece?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one I've spent a lot of time trying to think about over the course of my career. I think that one thing we have to say is that the Greeks weren't in some profound way, magical. There was no miracle. It's sort of common back when I was a student to talk about the Greek miracle. I don't think there's anything miraculous about what happened in Greece, but I think it is distinctive. There we have in the Greek world a body of literature, a whole set of cultural developments that are, I think, unusual. So the reason that we study the Greek world as intensively as we do, the reason that so many people remain interested in it, is in part because the cultural products of that world really were distinctive, not just like everything else in the world, and remain attractive to us in some ways, or at least to many people. They're attractive because I think we can recognize them as both familiar enough, they're like enough, like us enough, but they're also, of course, different. It's another world. So it's another world that we can recognize. Doesn't seem desperately foreign, and yet it's foreign enough to be fascinating. All right. Why? I think the core argument is that the Greek world developed in a way that was in some ways quite unusual in world history, and that is it was a highly decentralized, extensive ecology of independent states. So, beginning in about the time of Homer, say around 750 BCE, and continuing down to well past the time of Aristotle in the 4th century BCE, the Greek world was divided into something in the range of 1,000 different independent states. While very small by modern standards, Athens was gigantic with a maximum population of perhaps 500,000 and a territory of about 1,000 square miles. It was however, a very extensive ecology of independent states. Probably by the time of Aristotle, somewhere around 8 million Greek speakers divided into these many, many independent states. Each of these states was, in some ways, in competition with other states, and yet also had developed ways of cooperating with other states. So we've got war. On the other hand, we've got a lot of trade, a lot of exchange of both ideas and practices. So the competition and cooperation is across this world of independent states instead of having a world, say, classical China, Han era China, in which there's a big centralized state that's pretty much organizing things at the top. And I think the competition and cooperation, new forms of cooperation, generate a lot of demand for innovation. There are a lot of potential for innovations, lots of experimenting going on. Not all of these states did things the same way. They had different forms of government, different forms of institutions. And those institutions could be borrowed when they work well in one state or one set of states across other states. And the same way with cultural products. So Athens turns out to be very good at making beautiful pots. They spread across the Greek world. Different forms of expression, tragedy, philosophy, history, once again, can be developed in one place and then adapted and spread around. So no one's telling everybody in this world what to do. There's no sort of standard way in which a state needs to be organized, and it just generates a lot of useful friction that creates the possibility ultimately for all kinds of productive exchange. And ultimately, this drives a lot of economic growth over time, and that sustains then the possibility for a lot of people have enough leisure to engage in new forms of cultural enterprise, and the result of that really is the sort of Greek civilization that is attractive to us today.
So in this book, I mean, The Greeks and the Rational, you focus on, I guess, one of those innovations, which is the emergence of what you call the practical reason, right? In order to get, so I would like to hear about your thesis in the book and so on, but I think that a good way of getting there, and actually that's how you build the narrative in the book itself, is to talk a bit about the title itself, right? So it's the Greeks and the Rational, right? And that responds to something. Do you want to tell us about that story?
Yeah, indeed. So when I was a graduate student, I was told by my Ph.D. advisor that one of the greatest books that had been written in the 20th century was by E.R. Dodds, and it was a book called The Greeks and the Irrational. And Dodds wrote this wonderful book based on his Sather classical lectures that he gave in 1949. The book came out 2 years later. Wonderful book about all of the ways in which the Greeks were really strange. The way in which they were not simply thinking about high philosophical abstractions, but rather that they were thinking about magic and religion and even shamanism, putting curses on one another, imagining all kinds of potentials for a spiritual existence. So what Dawes wanted to push away from was the idea that the Greeks were just these people who had produced Plato and Aristotle, this whole body of, as it were, rational work. So it was a wonderful book. Really changed the way we think about things. I was then invited to give the same lecture series that Dodds had given in 1949, exactly 70 years after. So in 2019, and I thought, well, what's left of the rational after the Dodds revolution? Because it really was a revolution. And I then thought it would be interesting to try to talk about not scientific rationality, because there'd been a lot of work on that, and only sort of secondarily the kind of philosophical rationality that had been the sort of target of Dodd's work, but rather instrumental or strategic rationality, the kind of rationality that economists tend to think about. The question was, did the Greeks have a conception of rationality, of the way that people behaved as rational beings, that in any way was consistent with the way that contemporary economists concerned with, for example, expected utility maximization think about the human motivation, the micro foundations of social order. And, the book argues, I argued in the book, yes, the Greeks, in fact, had thought through a lot of the background assumptions and had developed, indeed, an entire theory of human motivation that was, in many ways, really quite similar to the kind of background assumptions that economists make, the kind of rational actor theory that underpins a great deal of economic thought today.
So I think, and I remember when you first told me about the fact that you were working on this book and that the premise was um, that you could identify game theory in ancient Greece. I remember thinking that's quite revolutionary. I've never heard that as an economist, and I'm fairly well trained in the history of economic thought, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. I'm still like, after reading the book, like quite surprised by the fact, and it has made me question a lot the way in which the history of economic thought is done, and why do we pay attention to certain things and not to others, and so on. So I'm not surprised that economists had missed that this thing had happened, just because we're looking at ourselves and we're obsessed with modernity and with the 18th and 19th century ideas and so on. But I'm a bit surprised that um, I guess experts in the ancient world had not figured this out before. And I guess my question to you is, what was that the case? And I guess that some of my interest is to understand why, I guess, you guys were focused on this irrational or ritualistic dimension of society for so long. Like, what were the forces that kept that active? Um, but also, what was the thing that allowed you to perceive this and see what were you seeing that other people were not? And I don't know, how do you think about that?
Yeah, no, great. So I think there are various reasons that the discovery of practical reason that I claim in this book escaped the attention of ancient historians, classical philosophers, classicists for so long. So one reason I think is because, especially in the 20th century, there was a increasingly sort of firm commitment to the idea that the Greek world was radically different from modernity, that the idea that the Greeks were like us, which had been at least a fairly common conception in the 18th and up into the 19th century, was just rejected. That the Greeks were thought to be desperately foreign, was one of the ways people talked about it, or the past was a foreign country, a country that perhaps we could visit, perhaps we could learn some of its ways, but it was always going to be utterly foreign to us. And I think there were reasons for that. Partly it was correcting the sort of overenthusiastic attempts to sort of make the Greeks modern of some 19th century thinkers. But I think part of it was because contemporary 20th century thinkers wanted another place. They wanted a past that was other than our own. And this is, for example, quite prominent in the work of probably the greatest Greek historian of the 20th century, Moses Finlay, or M.I. Finlay, ultimately Sir Moses Finlay, knighted for his contributions to ancient history. Finlay began his career as a Marxist. He became sort of more of a Weberian as he went along, that was very impressed with the work of Karl Polanyi. Polanyi, really very interesting mid-20th century economist, was deeply concerned to find some way that was a non-capitalist, but not a fully Marxist form of economic activity. And he located it in the past. He wanted to say that there were alternatives to the way we do things today. And it had to then be that the past, people in the past just did things completely differently. They thought about things completely differently. They didn't have the same kind of motivations as we have today. And it was then possible to use the past as an alternative to everything that people in the 20th century didn't much like about modernity. I think that's at least one reason. Another reason is that the Greek philosophers, and really a lot of the book goes into analysis of philosophical texts. So the Greek philosophers were really concerned with two forms of reasoning. The instrumental reasoning that I emphasize in the book, but they thought of that as really only the foundation or the platform for a higher and a more important form of rationality or reasoning. And we can call that ethical reasoning. That is, reasoning not just that aims at getting what you want, but rather reasoning that aims at wanting the right thing, the thing that is truly best. So that instead of sticking with the idea of a kind of subjective rationality, that is, I want something, I have no particular reason to want it, I just happen to want it, how do I go about best getting it, or getting as much of it as I possibly can? And that's basically economic or instrumental rationality. But the philosophers thought that what you really ought to be doing is going for the thing that was actually best for you. And they thought that they could identify what was actually best for anybody. So the thing that would actually allow you to live a truly flourishing or a truly excellent or a truly fine and worthwhile life. So they were concerned then with a kind of an interpersonal measurement of your going for something could be measured against someone else going for something, and they could measure which one of you went for the better thing, which one of you was doing the more rational thing because you're going for the right thing, as opposed to the kind of intrapersonal measurement or ranking that economists are concerned with, getting clear about what you want more than something else so that you're rational in terms of what you're actually going for. So I think that also tended to make the instrumental reasoning that sits behind all of this as a foundation, just made it invisible. Rationality became going for the right thing, not going for the thing you happen to want. And the Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, before them Socrates, were really worried that if people did just go for whatever they wanted and maximized and got good at maximizing whatever they happened to want, they'd actually make a mess of their lives. So they really were quite hostile to sticking at that subjective rationality level. They thought that was really quite, as it were, morally dangerous to you as an individual, dangerous to society. And so because of this emphasis on ethical rationality, the instrumental rationality that was the platform for the whole philosophical, whole moral sort of enterprise just became invisible. It was like the foundations were deep, and everyone, as it were, focused on the beautiful mansion that was built up, rather than looking at the foundations that made it possible for the mansion to actually stand. So I sort of dug down and said, well, what are the foundations? What are they basing their conception of ethical rationality on? And I argued then that it is a conception of instrumental or strategic rationality, practical reason.
Let me ask you now something that has probably a mythological motivation, but now that you mentioned how a good part of what you do is to read these classical authors and interpret them, I would like to hear you describe how this actually works. What are the sources that you actually use? And again, think about our audience as very not particularly smart economists, as most economists are indeed. And we don't do much more than work with data in a computer or with models. And usually that requires a pen and a notebook. So this whole idea of thinking about ancient documents, where do you get those documents? What's the translation? I guess you use compilations that have emerged over the centuries of different pieces and so on, but also how that, like, you read these documents and you interpret them, and then your interaction with other scholars is about, well, in this given page Plato says something and I think that you're interpreting it wrong. How does even the conversation happens among the community? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so we have a very large body of literary texts have come down to us from the Greek antiquity. And it's really because these texts were pretty much continuously thought to be interesting and worthwhile, that therefore they were recopied and survived by being recopied time and time again, all the way down from the time of Homer, say, to our own age. We've lost a huge amount. We probably have maybe 5 or 10% of the texts that were written, the serious literary texts that were written in antiquity. But we have still a lot, hundreds of texts, and the process by which they survived was a kind of winnowing out. The ones that got read a lot, the ones that were considered to be at various generation after generation the best, were the ones that were copied over again and again. So among these are a body of work by philosophers like Plato, who wrote dialogues, a whole good large number of dialogues between his teacher Socrates and various other intellectuals that Socrates might have known. We have no idea really how accurate these are as records of actual conversations, but it certainly captures a lot of what Plato thought was Socrates' thought, and then his own development of that thought. And these dialogues often deal with questions of human agency. Why do people do things? Do they do the right thing, the best thing for themselves? Do they create the best kind of communities or the worst kind of communities or something in between? So they deal with politics, with ethics, with morality, as well as with epistemological and metaphysical questions. And the same thing with the works of Aristotle. We have dozens of Aristotle's philosophical essays, each one of which addressed some particular area of what Aristotle thought was important aspect of human existence, or for that matter, natural existence. He wrote lots of things about biology and astronomy, as well as writing about politics and ethics. And then we have histories by really historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, who wrote histories either of earlier periods of their own time. There were a whole range of other kinds of writing, drama, comedy, tragedy, lyric poetry, and so on and so forth. It was a world in which there were a lot of intellectuals talking with one another, sharing ideas, borrowing ideas, trying to, competing for audiences. And this large body of literature, once again, some of which has now come down to us, and that therefore we can read in Greek, and now it's been translated into a whole range of contemporary modern languages. So this is really a big part of what classicists study. And the idea is to try to understand what were each of these thinkers really trying to get across. What are the ideas that they were struggling with? What were the key questions that they were worried about? And how did then the answers to those questions develop over time? And because we have earlier literature and later literature from the Greek world, we can work on that as well. So this is then people who study this and debate what was really going on here. What does Plato really mean us to take up from a story about, for example, a guy in Anatolia who found a magic ring and then could, made him invisible so that he could do whatever he liked. But why would Plato, a moral philosopher, tell a story about a guy who has a magic ring? Well, my argument is that he wanted to explain what are baseline human motivations when all social constraint is eliminated. Now, in the story, the guy who finds the magic ring can do what he likes because no one can see him. He can accomplish anything that he chooses, and the story suggests that he'll simply break every rule that his society had in order to get the most of what he wants, which turns out to be basically wealth and sex and power. So my argument then is that Plato tells us this story because he's really trying to isolate at least one set of claims that were being made by intellectuals in his time about human motivation, which is then stripped of all of the ordinary social constraints that will get in the way of doing just whatever you want. And starting then with this baseline idea of the human actor who will simply maximize on his most primitive desires. Plato then has to say, well, how would we create a good society in the face of that kind of baseline motivation?
Okay, we're back. There was brief interruption that we had for technical reasons, but I want to get back to where we left the conversation, and what I was trying to do was trying to articulate a question that was in the back of my head while I was reading the book, which was the sort of practical motivations behind the emergence of these ideas, right? So during the 20th century, when we think about the emergence and expansion of game theory, the Cold War setting was particularly important, and strategic behavior was crucial for practical reasons, for geopolitical reasons. And you could tell that that was behind the papers that were being written, although they were not exactly framed as applied papers that were designed to help the US deal with a potential nuclear attack or something like that. But it was clear that those motivations were there. And I'm wondering if that's the case also in the setting that you're exploring, right? Are there some practitioners that were motivating this? Were they writing at all? Or were these thinkers like Plato or Aristotle having that in mind? Were they trying to aim for the favor of a prince or a king or something? How do you do that? How can you recognize that in the text?
Yeah. So the argument that I make in the book is that as early as the time of Homer, say 8th century BCE, we can see people, the characters in these literary works, acting in ways that we can attribute to them some kind of strategic rationality. But the theory of strategic rationality, the ability to think about this abstractly as basically a theory of human motivation and behavior, one that actually could be refined, it could be taught, so that it could be a kind of expertise. One could become an expert in strategic behavior. So, like a game theorist can become an expert in doing game theory. You can work your way back on the game tree more efficiently than someone who is unfamiliar with game theory. So I think all of that, the discovery of practical reason, this is what the book's about, is comes about in a particular time in a particular place. It comes about in Athens, the biggest of the Greek city-states, and in the middle of the 5th century, when Athens was the most influential and the most powerful of the Greek city-states. Athens at this time had become an imperial center, had used the power that was generated out of the development of basically a democratic form of government, which allowed much more efficient use of a much larger manpower base than previous forms of social organization in Greece. And so Athens was a real center for intellectual activity. It was where you wanted to be. It was Paris in the 19th century. It was Rome in the 1st century AD. So the intellectuals from around the Greek world tended to congregate in Athens, and they were highly competitive with one another. They were basically trying to attract students. They were trying to attract attention. They were trying to, we would now say, build their brand. A lot of these intellectuals were called by then later Plato and Aristotle, who come in the next century, call them the sophists, the people who were purported to be able to teach wisdom, Sophia in Greek. So what would the sophists care about? Well, they claim to be able to teach you, as a prospective student, how to organize your own affairs, basically how to organize your household, how to organize the apparatus of your life, become wealthy, and then how to be influential in your city, in your city-state, how to be a politician. And they thought these two things really went together pretty well. This is also a time of great power competition. So we've got these intellectuals competing with each other for students, for coming up with explanations about human behavior. And we also have states that are competing with each other at a higher level than was previously possible. Athens and its rival state Sparta have become really powerful in that they're each controlling large blocks of other states, alliance systems, and intellectuals are becoming increasingly worried about what's going to happen here. So, for example, Thucydides writes his great history of the war between Athens and Sparta as an analysis of state power. And the motivation of states when they're engaged in very high stakes competitions over influence, resources, other states. So I think that in many ways it is the 20th century kind of period. A lot of the game theory, of course, developed in the United States, which was at that point a emerging great world power, engaged in a very high stakes competition with another great world power, at that point the Soviet Union, and a lot of concern about what's going to happen. Is it possible to avoid the most catastrophic outcomes? And so, yes, I think there were in many ways, the situation was in some ways similar. There were reasons for people to come, for example, from Hungary, where a number of major intellectuals working on game theory end up coming from Hungary, end up in the United States because of the world situation at that point, and they end up working on problems of the competition between these two great nuclear powers, the U.S. and the USSR, in the same sort of way that intellectuals tended to gravitate towards Athens and concern themselves with the great state competition between Athens and Sparta.
Let me ask you one final question about the book, which is because so your thesis is not just that, or what you want to say is not just that the Greek had discovered practical reason, but you also want to claim that there are things that we can learn from their approach to this idea, right? That there are lessons that our modern world can extract from this. What are those lessons? You already anticipated a bit, like this ethical approach that Greek philosophers had, but I would like to hear what's the message that you want to transmit there.
Yeah, I think the core thing that I'd like to bring out is that practical reason, understood as strategic rationality, understood as expected utility maximization, whether by an individual or whether by a community or by a state, is a really important part of how we need to be thinking about how the world works, how people are motivated, how they act, how states are motivated, and how they act. It's also incomplete. It's not adequate as a complete explanation. Once again, the Greeks understood this, so that Thucydides, in writing his great history of the war between Athens and Sparta, talks about the way in which both the competitors acted and believed that they were acting rationally, perfectly good game theoretic kind of ways, but also how other agents, some other states, refused to act rationally, acted irrationally, acted off the path of the game, and did so systematically, did so in ways that I think Thucydides suggests a rational actor ought to anticipate. So they give us, I think the Greeks give us both a theory of strategic reason, pure self-interest based utility maximization. They give us a theory of deviations from reason or for pure strategic reason. And they also give us, as we were talking about earlier, a theory of ethical reasoning. That is, the idea that perhaps you ought to think about what it is that you should want, not only what it is that you do want, but what it is that you should want, so that maximizing simply on accumulating material goods may actually not be the best for either yourself as an individual, hoping to live a fully realized, flourishing life, nor perhaps the best for the community that you live in or the larger world of human communities. So I think that putting strategic rationality, game theoretic kind of reasoning into a context of that we understand its limits, we understand the ways in which it doesn't engage with important ethical questions, allows us to really use game theory, use strategic reasoning, recognize it as important without turning it into the be-all and end-all. I think there's a tendency, certainly among many humanists, to want to say that we should reject the idea of strategic reason, that is somehow wicked, that it is a way of thinking that is malicious, and that seems to me to be foolish. It seems to me silly to say that this is we should reject the phenomenon of strategic reason because we believe it to be ethically limited. Rather, I think we should try to understand it, but also try to understand its limits and ethical alternatives.
That's fantastic. I really love that element of the book, right? Like it probably brings like the crucial elements into what a social scientist should be thinking of. And I think that we regularly, I guess, get lost in like the everyday motivations of our profession, and we forget about those things. So I'm very happy that you bring that up. Let me use the opportunity and the fact that we're talking, and now this is on record. I would like to ask you about the Stanford Civics Initiative. You came up with this fascinating idea of creating a project that I admire profoundly. I must say I'm a fellow at the Stanford Civics Initiative, so I'm not saying that because that's the case. I truly believe in the project, and probably not many people know about it. How do you describe it, and why are we doing what we're doing?
Yeah. So the Stanford Civics Initiative emerged almost accidentally, but it's now pretty well established, as you know. The goal of the initiative is to allow Stanford students, and ultimately, as a model, students in other universities in the United States and elsewhere, to take the kind of courses that we involved in this initiative believe they ought to have been offered in any good university. That is, courses that not only are involved with helping them to be more effective in the economic realm, so good at, for example, coding, or good at various forms of engineering, or sort of, as it were, economic skills, but should also be offered courses that help them to become effective in terms of their skills as citizens, and specifically as citizens of democratic societies. So we are sort of value-centered. We do think it would be better to have a democracy than not have a democracy. And we think that democracy is actually quite difficult to get and to keep. And it's impossible to get and keep if citizens of a democracy don't have a sense of what it is to be a citizen. And that, I think, is a major part of the education, higher education, that's often been forgotten in even great universities like Stanford. So the goal really is to offer a range of courses, your own course, for example, that talks about the history of economic thought. Strangely, there weren't courses that engaged with the history of economic thought that talked about both Marx and Adam Smith and Friedrich Hayek and John Maynard Keynes, and put them all into a kind of context. Or courses like mine in the origins of political thought that engages with, well, how is it that the Greek thinkers came to worry about justice and interdependence and power and legitimacy, or a whole range of courses that deal with basically the kind of skills and thinking that citizens need to bring to the work of being an effective decision maker, leader, voter, engaged individual in a democratic community. It's much more demanding than simply being a subject of a ruler, because in a democracy, it's us, the citizens, who have to ultimately be those who make the rules directly or through our representatives and interpret those rules and are ultimately responsible for enforcing those rules. And unless we have some idea about, well, how are rules made? Where do they come from? What are the costs of coming up with rules that are not incentive compatible, rules that people won't follow? What are the trade-offs between abstract ideas of ideal justice and available options that can be sustained through the kind of bargains that citizens can make with one another? We lack that kind of skills. We lack that kind of capacity to think historically, as well as sociologically, as well as economically, as well as philosophically. If we can't put those pieces together, we're not going to be effective citizens of a democracy. So the Civics Initiative basically says, well, that's what we should have. We should hire really terrific teachers who are absolutely dedicated to teaching, and dedicated to teaching in a way that is not polarized. It is not partisan. It's not telling the students that there's one correct outcome when thinking about these value questions: a left outcome or a right outcome or a capitalist outcome or a Marxist outcome, but rather asks students to and invites them and requires them to debate serious questions of value, good and bad, right and wrong, positive and negative outcomes, makes them think about that in the terms of costs and benefits, about availability of particular options, about the trade-offs that come with compromise, and ultimately then gives them the kind of background skills, understanding, knowledge that they can use in going forward and being effective members of a democratic community. So that's what it's about. Once again, it's the shorthand is we offer courses that your parents thought you were going to get when they sent you to school in the first place.
I've heard you once saying that what we do in a certain way is to bring back the soul of the university that at some point maybe was lost for many reasons. And I feel I'm always very inspired by your words and the purpose and objectives of the initiative. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for creating like something that has like so much meaning and gives us an idea of that we're doing something that has an impact.
Yeah, it is. It's been exciting, and the fact that so many Stanford students seem to be flocking to our courses. They want to take courses that are challenging, that are not just about how to get a bigger salary when you get out of Stanford. So your courses, I think you have a large waiting list because more students want to take it than are allowed to take it. So I think it really has been very gratifying to see that students are really responding to this. They're not just simply trying to only take the courses that are going to make them more economically viable, but rather they do want courses that'll allow them to really think about the big questions that maybe when they were first on their way to college, they thought they were going to be able to talk about. So I think it has a real future, and I think this is what every serious university in the world should be engaged with, at least universities that are located in countries where democratic citizenship is something that sustains a way of life.
Thank you very much, Josh. Thank you for having the time to talk with us about your book, but also just for pursuing like your research agenda that connects us through our past and make us think about who we are as individuals, as society, for pushing initiatives such as the Stanford Civics Initiative. Thank you for all that. I'll see you soon in our office.
Well, thank you very much, Javier. It's wonderful to have a chance to have this conversation. It's having colleagues like you that makes this just such a great job.
Thank you very much.